Once upon a time, there was a monster that was a rather intriguing generic boss monster, but then power creep clipped its wings. The monster, Light and Darkness Dragon. In the past, LADD was a rather nasty monster with the ability to negate any spell speed 2 or lower card effect for a 500 attack and defense cost. And at 2800 attack and 2400 defense, you commonly netted at least 2 to 3 negates before it bought the farm. However, now in modern Yu-Gi-Oh, there appears to be too many outs, as it were, to LADD in the form of kaijus, various counter traps, most notably Solemn Strike, and other chainable effects to sidestep its once per chain negation effect. Most would argue that these restrictions, along with its no special summons condition and its one-sided board wipe when it's destroyed and sent to the graveyard, has killed the playability of LADD. So there obviously is no place for LADD in this brave new world of Yu-Gi-Oh! Let's find out if that theory is correct. When looking at LADD directly, it is a 2800 attacker with 2400 defense that negates any spell speed 2 or lower effect upon its activation, no matter where or when it occurs. And the effect is mandatory, meaning that it affects you as well as your opponent. Note that that defense value is important because what some people may forget is when LADD negates, it also loses that defense. So from an attack perspective, you may have 5 negates before LADD cannot negate anymore due to a lingering 300 attack value. With only 2400 defense, without any reset, LADD caps out at 4 negates, with its defense dropping to 400 and its attack remaining at 800. The single-sided field wipe is really not that big of a deal because you can somewhat design a deck around minimizing the destructive nature of the wipe. Also, the free summons you get from the graveyard when LADD is destroyed and sent to the graveyard can be rather useful depending on what monster you bring out. When constructing an LADD deck, there appear to be 2 major strategies: using its effect and presence to complement general stun element, and to place it in its, in a sense, natural habitat, in the presence among its fellow dragons. Looking at the generic stun deck first, because this deck is somewhat focused on LADD, with limited acquisition opportunity for LADD, because most of the searching components do lean dragon in nature. I run 3 copies of LADD to maximize acquisition probability. If we were to break the bank, so to speak, to add additional stun and annoyance elements for the remaining monsters, I would run 3 copies of Thunder King Rai-oh as a central stun element. Shut down searching. This deck doesn't search a lot outside of one particular engine. 1900 attack, and a single inherent summons negation. 3 copies of good old Masterpiece to act as a second boss type monster, and when it's immune to monster effects, Masterpiece can remain on the field despite LADD's board wipe, making it LADD and Masterpiece a rather devastating combination. 3 copies of Juragedo for opponent attack interruption, life point gain, special summoning to set up LADD summoning during main phase 2, or Masterpiece summoning during main phase 2, among other things. For those who don't like Masterpiece in this deck, you can sub him out and then tag in 3 copies of Fairy Tale Luna and 1 copy of Fairy Tale Snow for additional stun, interruption, annoyance elements. Closing out the monsters, I run the Windwitch engine, 3 copies of Ice Bell, 2 copies of Glass Bell, and 2 copies of Snow Bell to provide both a free monster for attributing an Ice Bell and Snow Bell, and its special summoning ability. Note that the monster summoned by Ice Bell, this will almost always be Glass Bell, cannot be used for tribute, but Snow Bell, that you will commonly search off of the summoned Glass Bell, can be special summoned when both Ice Bell and Glass Bell are on the field, and then you can tribute summon LADD by using both the Ice Bell and the Snow Bell as the tribute fodder, leaving the summoned Glass Bell. Also, let's just not forget that when LADD or Masterpiece is not available or desired, the Wind Witches can also spit out a Crystal Wing that cannot be destroyed by opponent card effect. While I do not run it, 2 or 3 copies of Eidos, the Underworld Squire, can also be used in this deck instead of a card like Juragedo to supplement LADD summoning. However, I feel Juragedo has more versatility. For the spells, I run my staple field clearance of 1 copy of Raigeki and 1 copy of Darkhole, along with the newly released from the ban list 1 copy of Monster Reborn. For while it cannot revive LADD, there are a number of other quality targets it can put back on the field. 2 copies of Forbidden Chalice serve a dual-purpose role in this deck. First, it does the obvious thing of shutting down opponent monster effects during either turn. Second, it helps reset the attack of LADD by chaining it to the effect, negating the effect, which then, at the conclusion of the turn, resets the attack points of the targeted LADD to 2800. The real value of Forbidden Chalice in this deck is the ability to use it during your turn to reset LADD's effect while still getting the original effect that the LADD was trying to negate. It's largely the way you play around LADD's mandatory negation effect while you get that cherry on top of the sundae resetting his attack power, so he's ready to negate anew during your opponent's turn. Another potential card that can accomplish this goal is Book of Moon and/or Book of Eclipse. However, I find more usefulness from Chalice over either of the books. As a 2 tribute light monster, 3 copies of Photon Sanctuary work well as tribute fodder for LADD. You can use it as tribute fodder for Masterpiece. You can use it as link material for a light-based link monster, or just a 2-monster wall that sits in defense position to buy you some time. 2 copies of Instant Fusion provide some nice tribute fodder opportunities in addition to extra deck versatility, but you do need to be careful about some of the restrictive conditions on other cards in this deck, most notably Photon Sanctuary and its light-only condition, and the Windwitch's 1 copy of Upstart for standard general speed and consistency increase. Finally, the deck needs some additional spell-based support for Masterpiece summoning. Now, both True Draco continuous spells are possibilities because of their graveyard effects. Thus, you are able to net something out of them if they are on the field when LADD gets destroyed and finds the graveyard. But I prefer 2 copies of Swords of Concealing Light to break non-link based boards and provide that additional tribute fodder for Masterpiece. In addition to somewhat clearing the way outside of those Solemn for your Windwitch plays and your LADD summoning. For the traps, we can kill 2 birds with 1 stone, so to speak, by keeping with the Masterpiece aid summoning theme, as well as add that annoying extra stall and stun. To this end, I run 3 copies of Fiendish Chain, which works nicely protecting LADD when the opponent tries to chain a monster effect to its negation effect, or you can just chain Fiendish Chain to a monster that would later run LADD over. 1 copy of True King's Return for obvious reasons, and for even more obvious reasons, 1 copy of Solemn Judgment. While running 3 copies of Evenly Matched also makes a lot of sense in this deck. For those who do not want to drop the even more additional cash for those evenly matched, I actually like kind of aggravating my opponent further by just running 3 copies of Safe Zone. Safe Zone is one of those incredibly annoying cards in this deck, for it can create huge obstacles for monster removal, especially when you attach it to LADD off of a chain, because then LADD becomes impossible to kill by battle. In addition, when setting up a Masterpiece summon, it acts as a form of targeting removal for your opponent monsters. For those not running Masterpiece, 3 copies of Torrential Tribute or your favorite hand trap should replace the Fiendish Chain. For the extra deck, I run 1 copy of Sea Monster of Theseus, 1 copy of Mavelus. Now, the reason I run this instead of something like Darkfire Dragon, which seems to be my level 4 staple for instant fusion, is its wind. So you can normal summon a glass spell, get glass spell search, then use instant fusion for Mavelus, and then go into something like a Stardust. Thousand Eyes Restrict, pretty nice. Steal your opponent's monster, then tribute it away for an LADD or a Masterpiece. Vermillion Dragon Mech, This is used for the snow bells and somewhat spent LADD. You got an LADD that's at 800 or 1300 attack. It can't negate anything or only has one negate left. You have a snowball in your hand, but no real other Windwitch pieces. Summon the snowbell, go into Vermillion. 2 copies of Crystal Wing Synchro Dragon, 1 copy of Stardust Dargon, 1 copy of Clearwing Dragon, 1 copy of Windwitch Winterbell, 1 Hi-Speedroid Chanbara, 1 Cairngorgon Antiluminscent Knight, 1 Tornado Dragon, 1 number 41 Babuska, 1 Castel the Skyblaster Musketeer, and 1 Gaga Cowboy. Obviously, I'm not partial to running Link monsters in this deck, but for those who want to run some Link monsters, especially the light-based ones, definitely a possibility with Photon Sanctuary. For the second type of build involving, in a sense, LADD's home deck, dragons, the options are Blue Eyes, Red Eyes, Felgrand, or random generic dragon. Felgrand is clearly not complete as an archetype, so to be a hybrid is difficult, especially with Felgrand itself not having the capacity to summon LADD from the graveyard. Between Red Eyes and Blue Eyes, I like Blue Eyes better, and while generic is an option, not really that great of an option. So let's get started with the Blue Eyes build, which is the most competitive build for LADDs of the dragon possibilities in my opinion. In this build, I run only 2 copies of LADD because a third copy can cause some major bricking due to other high-level monsters in the deck, 3 copies of Blue Eyes White Dragon, 2 copies of Alternative, and 1 copy of Spirit. Rounding out the monsters, I run 1 copy of Keeper of the Shrine for field control and setting up LADD summoning due to its 2 tribute effect, 3 copies of White Stone of Ancients, which does the job of providing synchro support, field control, and increases trade-in or other discarders from the hand efficiency by adding that Blue Eyes back to your hand from the graveyard. 3 copies of Maiden with Eyes of Blue, a card you don't see in a lot of other Blue Eyes decks, as a nice stall element as well as another summoning means. It combos really effectively with other cards like Sage and another one you'll see later. 1 copy of Sage with Eyes of Blue, which helps make power plays, searches Stone and Maiden, and can go into a nice link play with Link Karibo after that search if need be. But I find Sage to be a lot more situational than most other Blue Eyes players when you're not running Effect Veilers. 1 copy of Master with Eyes of Blue, which is nice for recovery, especially in a slower, non-Goliath or bust build like this one, and 1 copy of Protector with Eyes of Blue. You almost never see Protector in Blue Eyes decks, which is interesting because Protector does do a great job of unclogging a hand, for at its worst, it is a card that facilitates a Blue Eyes summons by itself and can combo efficiently with both Ancient and Maiden. However, the need for having a Blue Eyes in hand can limit its value to a single tech copy. For the spells, I run 3 copies of Photon Sanctuary for LADD, Blue Eyes, or Spirit summoning, along with some soft link summoning playmaking if so desired. 3 copies of Melody of Awakening Dragons for alternative and original Blue Eyes searching. 1 copy of Trade-In for some additional speed. The reason I don't run 3 copies, which is typically standard in most Blue Eyes builds, is because with the nature of the tuners I run for this particular build, in order to balance out some of the brickiness, the trade-ins can create more inefficiency than efficiency with their draws. 1 copy of Return of the Dragon Lord for special summoning and protection, along with 1 copy of Monster Reborn for similar purposes. 1 copy of Raigeki and 1 copy of Darkhole for standard field clearance. 1 copy of Upstart for standard general speed and consistency increase, and 1 copy of Foolish Burial for dumping various monsters to the graveyard to enhance their effects and playmaking. Keeper of the Shrine, Master with Eyes of Blue, and white stone. I run one copy of 1-for-1 for discarding big monsters or any monsters to summon one of the tuners for synchro and combo play. Finally, I run one copy of Forbidden Chalice in this deck versus the first build because of the consistency issues for without an established field, Chalice is pretty much a brick card. Finally, unlike other players, I like having a little defense in my Blue Eyes build because most other people run either OTK Blue Eyes or they run Goliath Stun Blue Eyes, and their mindset is, I'm just all in on this strategy. If it works, it works. If it doesn't work, well, I'm going to lose. Defense is irrelevant. For me, I play a more control-y defense is preferred Blue Eyes build. So for the traps, I run 3 copies of Torrential Tribute for field clearance, setting up a Keeper LADD summons because if I nuke my field, Keeper's in my graveyard, I'm destroying at least one dragon. More than likely, I've exhausted most of my opponent's summoning abilities. I put Keeper on the field because a dragon got destroyed, and if I have an LADD in hand, I can normal summon it with Keeper's 2 tribute effect during my next turn, and my opponent typically doesn't have any monsters, and now LADD has a chance to shine. Also, Torrential can be neutralized by Return's Graveyard effect, so it becomes a one-sided board clear relative to any dragon monsters on your side of the field. I run 3 copies of Blind Obliteration, or if you own them or can't afford them, 3 copies of Evenly Matched, and 1 copy of Solemn Judgment for obvious reasons. Due to the inclusion of LADD and the Photon Sanctuaries in the deck, I do not run the Goliath Stun combo because Photon Sanctuary does have that light-only summons condition on the turn you activate it, and Dark Matter is obviously a dark monster. Also, note that one of the biggest issues with this Blue Eyes build and the Blue Eyes LADD strategy in general is LADD is kind of a lone wolf. So LADD's role in this build is largely to almost suck up opponent resources and then later open the door for Blue Eyes to come onto the field and net the closing win with a big surge. For the extra deck, I run 1 Vermillion Dragon Mech, similar reason as for the first deck. There are times when your LADD will be down at 1300, maybe even 800 attack. You can summon one of your level 1 tuners and go into Vermillion. 1 Azure Eyes Silver Dragon, 2 Blue Eyes Spirit Dragon, 1 Cloud Castle, 1 Crystal Wing Synchro Dragon, 1 Michael the Light Sworn, 1 Black Rose Moonlight Dragon, 1 Hi-Speedroid Chanbara, 1 number 95 Galaxy Eyes Dark Matter Dragon. Even if the Goliath extra deck lockout isn't available for this deck, or is a heavily more inefficient because of those Photon Sanctuary, Dark Matter is still a very useful extra deck monster. True King of All Calamities. Number 38, Hope Harbinger Dragon Titanic Galaxy. Number 107, Galaxy Eyes Tachyon Dragon, Felgrand, and 1 Linked Karibo. Overall, between the 2 builds, I think the first build is better, but it can be more expensive to build in real life. And the Blue Eyes build is still rather effective in my opinion. One of the bigger problems with LADD in general is the lack of effective searching for its acquisition, and its mandatory effect significantly limits the explosive follow-up plays that can be made after LADD summoning. And obviously, the biggest weakness of LADD are those kaijus because you don't even get the graveyard summons effect. Basically, you just get the kaiju. Yay! The general goals of either of these decks, as mentioned earlier, but especially for the Blue Eyes version, is to use LADD more as a resource black hole for the opponent, frequently hoping that he or she needs to use at least 2 cards to get around LADD, which, if it doesn't get kaiju, will frequently happen, because the only other big out your opponent really will have to avoid a lot of resource drain is Utopia the Lightning. And then LADD goes to the graveyard because it eventually will get run over, and you use LADD's summons effect to put another meaningful target on the field. Yes, there are some cute techs for LADDs in the form of Interdimensional Matter Transporter or Moon Mirror Shield, but these cards, at least in my testing, were more inefficient than useful. In the end, LADD is generic, but does require certain attributes and features in the deck you run it in to be useful in a competitive build. These decks seem to do a good job at complementing LADD somewhat, but for LADD really to recover and make a renewed splash in modern Yu-Gi-Oh!, it needs some almost direct support monsters and cards, which will probably almost never happen. Well, those are my LADD decks. Thank you for your attention and your time. I'm out.